Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little darker. A time of plagues, punishments, and pottage. We're diving into what life was really like during the Middle Ages. Forget the castles and chivalry Hollywood sold you. The truth is, you probably wouldn't last a single day. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Medieval survival, the year 1325. Congratulations. You've just woken up in the year 1325. But before you open your eyes, your other senses tell you exactly where you are. The first thing you notice is the weight. It isn't the soft, airy weight of a down comforter. It's a crushing, damp, scratchy heaviness. You are covered by a single massive blanket made of raw, unwashed wool. Over the months, this wool has absorbed the moisture from the air, the soot from the central fire, and the various oils of your skin until it has become a thick, felted slab of organic matter. It smells of wet sheep and ancient wood smoke. You try to shift your weight, and the sound is unmistakable, the dry, aggressive crunch of straw. You aren't lying on a mattress as you understand it. You are lying on a tick, a giant linen sack stuffed with the byproduct of last season's harvest. In the beginning, it was soft and smelled of the field. Now, it has been compressed by your body weight into a series of lumpy, uneven ridges that dig into your ribs. But the straw isn't the only thing in the mattress. The heat of your body has created a perfect microclimate for the hidden guests. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs have made this straw the metropolis. You feel a sharp prick on your ankle, then your shoulder. You don't swat them. You can't. They are as much a part of the bed as you are. To live in 1325 is to accept that you are part of the food chain, even while you sleep. You finally open your eyes, and the room is a haze of dim gray light. There are no windows here, at least not in the sense of glass. Glass is a luxury for the God-fearing men in the cathedrals. Your home is a crook cottage, a simple structure built from curved oak timbers and walls made of wattle and daub, essentially a woven lattice of sticks plastered over with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. It is a breathable house, which is a polite way of saying the wind whistles through the cracks in the walls whenever it pleases. You look up at the ceiling. There is no chimney. In the center of the room is the hearth, a circle of blackened stones where a peat fire smolders perpetually. The smoke doesn't leave through a vent. It drifts upward, coating the underside of the thatched roof in a thick, protective layer of soot. This soot actually helps keep the bugs in the thatch from dropping onto your face. But it also means the air you breathe is a constant thin soup of carbon. Everything in your home is a shade of brown or gray. As you sit up, your joints protest. In the 14th century, the damp isn't just a weather condition. It lives in your bones. You are 22 years old, but your spine feels like an old piece of leather left out in the rain. There is no me time in this awakening. Beside you, your younger brother is already stirring. On the other side of the room, your parents are rising. In the corner, the family goat, tethered to a post, lets out a low, mournful bleat. You share this space with everyone: family, livestock, and insects. Privacy is a concept that won't be invented for centuries. Every cough, every sigh, every movement is communal. You are never alone, and in the freezing cold of a medieval morning, that is both a comfort and a curse. The social ritual of toileting and hygiene. Now that you are upright, the urgency of nature takes over. But in 1325, nature calling involves a series of steps that would make a modern human weep. There is no hallway leading to a porcelain sanctuary. There is no running water, no silver-plated faucets, and certainly no lavender-scented soap. If you are lucky, your family keeps a wooden bucket in the corner of the hovel. If you are less lucky, you have to head outside into the toft, the small yard behind your cottage. The morning air hits your skin like a blade, and your bare feet find the mud instantly. This mud is a mix of rain, earth, and the slops from yesterday. You find the designated pit the cesspool. It is a hole in the ground, occasionally lined with stones, but mostly just a raw excavation of the earth. The smell is a physical force. It is the concentrated essence of a family's existence, unshielded by chemicals or ventilation. You finish your business, and now comes the question of the wipe. You reach for what is available. In the summer, you might find broadleaves dock leaves are a favorite for their size and softness. In the winter, you are reduced to handfuls of dry straw, which is abrasive and unpleasant, or perhaps a clump of dried moss, if you were smart enough to gather some from the woods. If you were a monk or a wealthy merchant, you might have a pessarium, a piece of wool, or even a smooth stone. But for you, the peasant, life is rough literally. The disposal of this waste is the next hurdle. In a village, it might eventually be used as fertilizer, but in a town, the situation is much more public. If you were living in a crowded city like London or Paris, you would take your bucket to the front door, look up and down the narrow, timber-framed street, and shout, "Gardez-vous." This is a warning to anyone walking below that a deluge of night soil is about to descend from your window. The streets are designed with a kennel, or a shambles, a central gutter meant to carry waste away, but it rarely works. Instead, the streets become a viscous, black sludge that never truly dries. Hygiene doesn't improve much once you've finished. You don't wash your hands with warm water and soap. Soap exists, made from wood ash and animal fat, tallow, but it is harsh, smells of lye, and is mostly used for laundry. Instead, you might dip your fingers into a basin of cold standing water. You dry them on your tunic. The concept of germs is a fantasy. To you, disease is caused by miasma, bad air, or the judgment of God. Therefore, if you can't see the dirt, it isn't there. Your fingernails are permanently rimmed with the black soil of the fields, and your skin has a persistent sheen of wood smoke and sweat. You don't smell bad to your neighbors because they smell exactly like you. You all share a collective, heavy musk of unwashed wool and fermented ale. It is the smell of humanity in its rawest form. The morning feast, pottage and small ale. Hunger in the Middle Ages is not a craving. It is a constant, low-level hum in the back of your skull. You head back inside for the first meal of the day. There is no table setting. You take your trencher, a thick, stale slice of 4-day-old bread that serves as your plate. This bread is made of maslin, a mixture of rye and wheat, or more likely, just straight barley and beans. It is dark, dense, and contains enough grit from the millstone to slowly grind down your teeth over the years. In the center of the hearth sits the everlasting pot. This is a heavy iron cauldron that almost never leaves the fire. Inside is the pottage. It is the foundation of your life. It is a thick, gelatinous stew made of oats, leeks, cabbage, and whatever else survived the garden. It is never truly finished. You simply add more water and more vegetables as the days go by. Sometimes a piece of salt pork might be added for flavor, but that is a rare luxury. Mostly, you are eating a gray-green mush that tastes of salt and earth. You scoop the pottage onto your bread trencher. The bread absorbs the moisture, softening just enough that you can eventually eat the plate itself. To wash it down, you reach for a wooden tankard of small ale. This isn't the craft beer of the modern era. It is a thick, cloudy, lukewarm liquid that looks more like soup than a drink. It is unfiltered, meaning there are bits of grain and yeast floating on top. You drink it because the water from the stream is a death sentence. Upstream, a tanner is washing hides in that water. A few yards away, someone is bathing a horse. The water is a soup of bacteria, but the ale has been boiled. The fermentation process makes it safe. Even the toddlers drink it. You start your day slightly buzzed, not because you want to, but because it's the only way to stay hydrated without contracting cholera or dysentery. As you eat, you have to be careful. In years of bad harvest, the rye in your bread can develop a fungus called ergot. If you eat it, you don't just get sick, you hallucinate. You feel like your skin is on fire. You see demons in the shadows of the hovel. Whole villages have succumbed to St. Anthony's fire, thinking they were possessed by the devil, when in reality, they were just eating poisoned bread. You chew slowly, hoping the grain was dry when it was stored. Every meal in 1325 is a calculated risk. There are no FDA labels, no best buy dates. There is only the pottage, the ale, and the hope that you'll survive until sunset. The wardrobe and the war on pests. Dressing for the day is a simple affair because you only own one outfit. You don't have a closet. You have a peg on the wall. You pull on your linen, chemise, or undershirt. This is the only garment that ever gets washed, and even then, only a few times a year using a mixture of stale urine, which acts as a bleaching agent, and river water. Over this, you slide your wool tunic. Wool is the miracle fabric of the Middle Ages. It is warm even when wet, and it is incredibly durable. However, it is also incredibly scratchy. Without modern softening agents, the fibers of your tunic are like tiny saws against your skin. And because the tunic is rarely washed, it has become lanolized. The natural oils of the wool, mixed with your own body oils, have created a water-resistant crust. It is stiff, heavy, and smells like a wet dog that has been sitting near a campfire. You pull on your brise, loose linen trousers, and secure them with a cord. Over your legs, you wrap wool hose, which are held up by garters. There is no elastic here. If your garters loosen, your hose sag around your ankles, a constant annoyance during a day of labor. Finally, you put on your shoes. These are turn shoes, made of a single layer of untanned leather. They have no arch support, no cushioning, and the soles are as thin as a piece of cardboard. You feel every pebble, every root, and every frozen clump of mud through the bottom of your feet. But as you dress, you realize you aren't alone in your clothes. You are carrying a portable ecosystem. Your seams are the breeding grounds for body lice. They lay their eggs in the warm, dark folds of your tunic, and as your body heat rises throughout the day, they wake up. The medieval itch is a constant background noise of life. You see your father scratching his ribs. You see your mother reaching behind her neck. It is a universal language. Lice aren't just an annoyance. They are a health hazard. They carry typhus, though you don't know that. You just know that some people get the fever and never wake up. To combat the pests, you might carry a small piece of fur, flea trap, soaked in honey or grease, hoping the bugs will jump onto the fur instead of you. It rarely works. You simply learn to live with the crawling sensation. You develop a habit of the medieval shrug, a quick twitch of the shoulders to dislodge a bug that has ventured too far. You are a walking hive of activity, wrapped in wool, struggling to maintain a dignity that the insects are constantly trying to undermine. Segment 5. The labor, the church, and the looming end. The sun is finally over the horizon, and it's time for work. In 1325, your job isn't something you do to find yourself. It is something you do to avoid starvation. For 90% of the population, this means the fields. You head out to the open field system. You don't own this land. It belongs to the lord of the manor. You are a villain, a tenant who is bound to the soil. The work is backbreaking in the most literal sense. You spend your day bent over a heavy wooden plow, pulled by a team of exhausted oxen. The soil is heavy clay, and every step is a struggle against the suction of the mud. If it's harvest time, you are swinging a scythe until your blisters burst and bleed, then callus over, then burst again. There is no weekend. You work 6 days a week, from sun to sun. The only thing that breaks the monotony is the church bell. It rings for matins, for vespers, for the Angelus. The church is the only boss more powerful than the Lord. You are required to stop and pray, to remind yourself that this suffering is temporary, and that a golden paradise awaits you, provided you pay your tithe. 10% of everything you produce to the priest. If your cow has 10 calves, one belongs to the church. If you harvest 10 sacks of grain, one goes to the rectory. You are working for the Lord, the church, and finally, for the meager bowl of pottage that waits for you at home. As the day ends, you look at your hands. They are stained, calloused, and the joints are swollen. You might have a small cut from a stray piece of wheat. In 2024, you'd put on a bandage and some antiseptic. In 1325, that cut is a potential death sentence. If it turns red and angry, the village-wise woman might tell you to apply a poultice of moldy bread and spiderwebs. This sounds like witchcraft, but strangely, the moldy bread contains primitive penicillin. If that doesn't work, the priest will tell you to pray to St. Roch. If that doesn't work, you will develop the black streak up your arm. And within a week, the church bell will ring for you, not to call you to work, but to tell the village that another soul has left the year 1325. You head back to your hovel as the light fades. You eat your pottage, drink your ale, and crawl back onto your straw mattress. You pull the heavy, greasy wool blanket up to your chin, listen to the goats breathing in the corner, and feel the first flea of the night bite your shoulder. You've lasted 1 day in the Middle Ages. Only 364 more to go until you get to do it all over again, in the cold, the dark, and the dirt. The transformation from Sophie to Catherine. Long before she was Catherine the Great, Empress of all Russia, mistress of reform, and icon of ambition, she was simply Sophie. Born Sophie Friedrich August von Anhalt-Zerbst in 1729, she was the daughter of a relatively obscure German princely family. Her tiny duchy in Pomerania offered little in terms of global power, but Sophie herself possessed something no title could provide: a razor-sharp intelligence, a relentless charm, and a quiet, burning hunger for greatness. Her upbringing was strict, molded by the expectations of the minor German nobility. Her mother, Johanna, was cold and calculating, a social climber obsessed with status, who viewed her daughter more as a strategic pawn than a child. Sophie's father, a Prussian officer, was more distant, his life defined by the rigid discipline of the military. From a young age, Sophie learned to walk the fine line between obedience and cunning. She read voraciously, often staying up by candlelight to study history and philosophy. And she mastered the art of observation, learning how to read a room before she ever spoke in it. These were the survival tools she would soon need in the most brutal court in Europe. In 1744, the summons came. The Russian Empress Elizabeth Petrovna was searching for a bride for her heir. Grand Duke Peter, and Sophie was chosen. At just 14 years old, she was bundled into a carriage for a grueling months-long journey across the frozen plains of Eastern Europe. She arrived in St. Petersburg during a blizzard, a tiny figure wrapped in thin German wool, stepping into a world of gold-leafed palaces and terrifying secrets. Sophie understood immediately that to survive in Russia, she had to become Russian. She spent her nights pacing her freezing bedroom, barefoot on the floor to keep herself awake, as she memorized Russian vocabulary and practiced the guttural sounds of the language. She pushed herself so hard that she developed pneumonia, nearly dying before she had even begun her ascent. But even on her sickbed, she insisted on seeing a Russian priest rather than a Lutheran pastor. This was her first great political act. She converted to Orthodoxy, taking the name Catherine or Yekaterina. She wasn't just changing religions. She was burning the bridge behind her. The quiet German girl was gone, and in her place stood a woman who was ready to claim an empire, one cold, calculated step at a time. The marriage from hell and the viper's nest. The marriage of Catherine and Grand Duke Peter in 1745 was a celebration of imperial grandeur, but inside the private chambers of the palace, it was a slow-motion disaster. Peter, the man who was destined to rule Russia, was a tragedy in waiting. Immature, erratic, and deeply obsessed with the Prussian military, he spent his days playing with toy soldiers on banquet tables, rather than learning the art of statecraft. There are accounts of Catherine entering their bedroom only to find her husband holding a mock court-martial for a rat that had chewed on one of his wax figurines. He had no interest in his wife, often refusing to consummate the marriage for years, leaving Catherine in a state of agonizing isolation. She was a stranger in a foreign court, married to a man who despised his own country and watched constantly by the spies of Empress Elizabeth. The Winter Palace was not a home. It was a viper's nest of gossip, paranoia, and shifting alliances. One wrong word to the wrong lady-in-waiting could result in exile to Siberia or a quiet disappearance into a dungeon. To cope with the crushing loneliness and the constant threat of failure, Catherine turned to books. While the rest of the court was busy with masquerade balls and drinking bouts, she was devouring the works of Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Montesquieu. She studied law, economics, and history, preparing herself for a job she wasn't yet allowed to have. She realized that if she couldn't rely on her husband for power, she would have to build her own. She began to cultivate a shadow court of military officers, scholars, and diplomats. She used her charm to win over the powerful imperial guard, presenting herself as the true protector of Russian traditions. A stark contrast to Peter's open contempt for the Russian church and military. She endured years of public humiliation and private neglect, but she never complained. She waited. She observed the Empress Elizabeth's health decline, and she saw the court's growing resentment toward Peter. She knew that when the crown finally changed hands, it wouldn't be enough to simply be the wife of a Tsar. She would need to be the Tsar herself. The coup of 1762, the bloodless revolution. In January 1762, Empress Elizabeth died, and Peter III ascended to the throne. His reign was a masterclass in how to lose an empire in record time. In just 6 months, he managed to alienate every powerful faction in Russia. He signed a humiliating peace treaty with Prussia, offended the Orthodox Church by trying to secularize their lands, and insulted the army by forcing them to wear Prussian-style uniforms. He openly spoke of divorcing Catherine and marrying his mistress, a threat that gave Catherine the final push she needed. On the night of July 9, 1762, the air in St. Petersburg was thick with tension. Catherine, supported by her lover Gregory Orlov and his 4 brothers, made her move. She slipped out of the Peterhof Palace in a simple carriage, arriving at the barracks of the Izmailovsky Regiment. There, before the soldiers, she was proclaimed Empress. The scene was cinematic. Catherine, traditionally dressed in the green uniform of the guards, rode at the head of a massive army toward the capital. The people of St. Petersburg poured into the streets, cheering for the woman who seemed more Russian than the man born to the title. Peter, caught off guard at his country estate, found himself completely without allies. He had played with toy soldiers for so long that he didn't know how to lead real ones. He signed his abdication papers with a trembling hand, hoping for a quiet retirement. He didn't get it. A few days later, he was dead officially of hemorrhoidal colic, but unofficially at the hands of Catherine's supporters. Catherine was now the sole ruler of Russia. At her coronation in Moscow, the crown placed on her head contained over 5,000 diamonds, but the weight of the responsibility was even heavier. She was a foreign woman with no blood claim to the throne, ruling a nation of millions through sheer force of will. The German pawn had checkmated the king, and the era of Catherine the Great had officially begun. The philosopher queen and the Iron Hand. Catherine's reign was a constant struggle to balance the light of the Enlightenment with the darkness of Russian reality. She styled herself as a philosopher queen, corresponding directly with the greatest minds of her age. Voltaire called her the Star of the North, and she in turn became his greatest patron, even buying Diderot's entire library to save him from poverty. She wanted to modernize Russia, to drag it into the 18th century through education, science, and law. She was a pioneer of public health. When smallpox was ravaging the continent, Catherine was the first in Russia to be inoculated, a brave act intended to show her people that science was not to be feared. She drafted the nakaz, or instruction, a massive legal document that spoke of equality before the law and the abolition of torture. It was so radical that it was banned in France for being too revolutionary. However, Catherine was also a pragmatist who understood that her power rested on the support of the nobility. While she spoke of freedom in her letters to Paris, she strengthened the institution of serfdom at home to keep the landowning class loyal. She realized that she couldn't free the peasants without losing her crown. This contradiction defined her legacy. She built schools, hospitals, and libraries, and she founded the Hermitage Museum, amassing one of the greatest art collections in history. But she also crushed rebellions with terrifying efficiency. When the Cossack Yemelyan Pugachev led a massive peasant uprising, claiming to be the resurrected Peter III, Catherine sent her armies to dismantle his forces. Pugachev was brought to Moscow in a cage and executed, a grim reminder that while the Empress loved philosophy, she would never hesitate to use the sword. She expanded Russia's borders by over 200,000 square miles, taking Crimea and partitioning Poland, transforming Russia into the dominant power of Eastern Europe. She was a woman of the Enlightenment, but she ruled with an iron hand that would have made the Tsars of old proud. The legend, the lovers, and the final curtain. As Catherine aged, her private life became a source of international scandal and local legend. She never remarried, preferring a string of favorites, young, handsome military officers who served as her companions and advisors. The most significant of these was Gregory Potemkin, a man of immense intellect and ambition who became her co-ruler in all but name. Their relationship was a storm of passion and politics. Even after their romantic bond faded, they remained deeply devoted to one another. Potemkin was the one who oversaw the colonization of the South and the building of the Black Sea Fleet. The rumors that followed, Catherine whispers of insatiable lust and bizarre sexual practices, were largely the inventions of her enemies in the courts of Europe, men who were terrified of a woman who held so much power for so long. They couldn't understand her, so they tried to devalue her by attacking her womanhood. In her final years, Catherine grew increasingly disillusioned with the revolutionary spirit she had once admired. The French Revolution horrified her, the sight of a monarch being guillotined in the name of the Enlightenment. She had championed caused her to tighten her grip on her own empire. She became more conservative, more protective of the autocracy she had built. In November 1796, at the age of 67, Catherine suffered a stroke in her dressing room and died soon after. She had ruled for 34 years, transforming Russia from a distant, misunderstood land into a global superpower. She arrived as a girl with nothing but a suitcase and a name she would eventually discard, and she left as the most powerful woman in the world. When they laid her to rest, they found a note she had written for her own epitaph. It read, "When she arrived in Russia, she wished to do everything possible to promote the happiness of her subjects. She was easygoing, loved life, and was a true Republican in her soul. She was a woman of endless contradictions, but one thing was certain. She had earned the title the Great." The Red Queen of Palenque, the Maya mystery. Deep within the emerald embrace of the Chiapas jungle in southern Mexico, the ruins of Palenque rise like limestone ghosts above the mist. For centuries, the city sat in silence, reclaimed by cedar trees and howling monkeys, its once vibrant stucco facades fading into the gray of the stone. By the late 20th century, Palenque had become one of the most famous archaeological sites in the world, largely due to the 1952 discovery of Pakal the Great's tomb, hidden deep within the Temple of the Inscriptions. But the jungle was holding another secret, one that would remain buried until a hot, humid morning in 1994. A young Mexican archaeologist named Fanny Lopez Jimenez was conducting routine stabilization work on Temple 13, a modest-looking pyramid standing directly adjacent to Pakal's Grand Monument. While clearing debris, she noticed a small crack in a wall, hidden behind a patch of moss. When she peered through with a flashlight, she didn't see solid earth. She saw an empty space, a hidden corridor. The air that rushed out of that crack was heavy, smelling of damp limestone and 1,000 years of absolute stillness. It was the smell of a world that had been sealed while Europe was still in the middle of the Dark Ages. As the team carefully removed the stones, they discovered a narrow, vaulted staircase leading down into the heart of the pyramid. The descent was claustrophobic and slick with moisture. At the bottom, they found a small, cross-shaped chamber. Unlike Pakal's tomb, which was covered in elaborate glyphs and carvings, these walls were stark and undecorated. In the center of the room sat a single massive limestone sarcophagus. There were no looters' marks, no signs of disturbance. The room was a time capsule of the 7th century. As the archaeologists prepared to lift the heavy stone lid, the tension was palpable. They expected to find a noble, perhaps a priest or a minor prince. They didn't expect to find a vision in scarlet. They didn't expect a mystery that would challenge everything they knew about Maya royalty. When the lid finally groaned open, the beam of the flashlight hit a layer of dust so bright, so violently red, that it looked like fresh blood had been poured into the stone. Resting within this crimson cloud was the skeleton of a woman, hidden from the world for 13 centuries, waiting for her story to be told. The Crimson Shroud, the power of Cinnabar. The site of the Red Queen was unlike anything the archaeological world had ever seen. Every inch of the skeleton, the interior of the sarcophagus, and the funerary offerings were saturated in a thick, brilliant powder known as cinnabar. To the ancient Maya, this wasn't just a color. It was a sacred substance. Cinnabar is a mineral form of mercury sulfide, a toxic, volatile material that occurs naturally in volcanic regions. In its raw form, it is a deep, earthy red, but when ground into a fine powder, it becomes a vibrant vermilion. The Maya went to extraordinary lengths to obtain it, trading across vast distances to secure enough for royal burials. But why cinnabar? Why cover a queen in a substance that was essentially poison? The answer lies in the Maya obsession with the cycle of life and death. Red was the color of the east, the direction of the rising sun. It symbolized blood, a vital life force of the universe, and it represented the promise of rebirth. By bathing the Red Queen in cinnabar, her people were attempting to freeze her life force, ensuring that she would have the energy required to navigate the treacherous paths of the underworld. However, the beauty of the cinnabar came with a terrifying price. For the archaeologists working in the tomb, the red dust was a biohazard. Mercury sulfide is highly toxic. Even breathing the dust can lead to tremors, lung damage, and neurological decay. This toxicity was likely known to the Maya in a spiritual sense. They recognized cinnabar as a living mineral, a substance of extreme power that belonged to the gods. To touch it was to touch the divine. As the researchers carefully vacuumed away the dust to examine the remains, they realized that the cinnabar had acted as a bizarre preservative. While the flesh was long gone, the bones had absorbed the red pigment, becoming permanently stained. The Red Queen wasn't just wearing the color. She had become the color. Forensic analysis revealed that she was a woman in her late 30s or early 40s at the time of her death. She suffered from osteoporosis and had a diet rich in meat, a sign of her high status. But most strikingly, her skull showed the telltale signs of noble Maya beauty, intentional cranial deformation. As an infant, her head had been bound between boards to create a long, sloping forehead, a shape meant to mimic an ear of corn, the most sacred plant in the Maya world. She was a woman shaped by ritual from her first breath to her last, a crimson icon of a civilization that viewed death as merely the beginning of a much larger journey. The jade mask and the map of souls. If the cinnabar was her shroud, then her jewelry was her armor. Spread across the Red Queen's skeleton was a collection of jade, shell, and pearls that formed a glittering map of Maya cosmology. Most breathtaking was her funeral mask. Unlike the single-piece gold masks of other cultures, the Red Queen's face was covered by a delicate mosaic made from over 100 tiny pieces of malachite and jade. These green stones were the antithesis of the red cinnabar. If red was death and blood, green was life, water, and the breath of the soul. The mask served a dual purpose. It preserved her identity for the gods of the underworld, and it transformed her into a divine being. The eyes were made of obsidian and white seashells, giving her a haunting, lifelike gaze that seemed to stare through the archaeologists. Around her neck were triple-strand necklaces of jade beads, each one polished to a mirror-like shine. Jade was more valuable than gold to the Maya. It was the breath of the earth, and to be buried with this much of it was an ultimate display of cosmic wealth. But the offerings weren't just about beauty. Scattered around her body were hundreds of tiny artifacts that acted as a survival kit for the afterlife. There were bone needles, used for ritual bloodletting, suggesting that the Red Queen had been a priestess or a high-ranking participant in the city's most sacred rites. There were spindle whorls for weaving, obsidian blades for sacrifice, and small ceramic vessels that likely once held chocolate, corn gruel, or sacred wine to nourish her soul on its journey. At her feet, the archaeologists found the remains of two other people, a child and an adult woman. These were sacrificial victims, intended to serve as her guides or servants in the world beyond. To the modern mind, this is a chilling detail, but to the people of Palenque, it was a necessary part of the ritual. The Maya believed the afterlife, or Xibalba, was a dangerous maze filled with rivers of blood and trickster gods. A queen could not be expected to navigate such a realm alone. Every jade bead, every sharpened blade, and every sacrificed soul was a tool, a piece of equipment for a spiritual war. The Red Queen was being sent into the darkness, not as a victim, but as a warrior goddess, equipped with the finest technology her civilization could provide. The mystery of her name. Who was she? For decades after her discovery, the Red Queen's greatest mystery was her name. The tomb contained no inscriptions, no glyphs, no written records. In Maya archaeology, this is incredibly rare for a burial of such high status. Paykal the Great's tomb was a literal library of his achievements, but the Red Queen was a silent enigma. This led to a fierce debate among scholars. Who was this woman buried so close to the greatest king in Maya history? The most popular theory was that she was Lady Sakbu Ajah, Paykal's wife. She was the woman who had stood by his side for decades, helping him transform Palenque from a struggling city into a magnificent empire. She was the mother of his successors, the matriarch of the dynasty. Proximity in death usually mirrored proximity in life. By placing her in Temple the 13th, right next to Paykal's Temple of the Inscriptions, the Maya were creating a perpetual royal couple, ruling from the spirit world just as they had from the palace. However, science would eventually provide a twist in the narrative. In 2012, DNA analysis was performed on the remains. The results showed that the Red Queen shared no maternal DNA with Paco. While this supported the theory that she was his wife, since royal marriage was typically exogamous, it ruled out the other major candidate, his mother, the powerful Lady Sack-Cock. Lady Sack-Cock was a legend in her own right, a woman who ruled Palenque as queen regent, and was the one who actually passed the throne to Paco. Some had argued that such a powerful mother deserved the crimson burial. But the carbon dating and the DNA pointed toward the wife, Lady Sackbua-Jaw. Yet the question remained, why no name? Why leave the most honored woman in the city nameless? Some historians suggest that the Maya didn't need to write her name because everyone at the time knew who she was. Her identity was woven into the architecture, the red dust, and the very air of the plaza. To write her name would be like labeling the sun. Others believe that the absence of text was a deliberate act of humility or a specific ritual requirement lost to time. She remains the Red Queen, a title given to her by the people who found her. A name that captures her power, even if it misses her true identity. The journey to Xibalba, Maya rebirth. To understand the Red Queen is to understand the Maya view of the end. In our modern world, we often see death as a hard stop where the story ends. But for the Red Queen, the closing of that limestone lid was simply the beginning of a cosmic drama. The Maya believed that the soul had to descend into Xibalba, the place of fear. This was a subterranean world of 9 levels, each more difficult than the last. To move through it, the soul had to pass through rivers filled with scorpions and pus, survive houses of shivering cold and jaguar attacks, and eventually defeat the Lords of Death in a ritual ball game. The cinnabar on her bones was the fuel for this journey. The jade mask was her disguise. The sacrificed guides were her scouts. If she succeeded, she would not simply find peace. She would be reborn as a divine ancestor, a celestial being who could influence the rains, the harvests, and the fate of her descendants in Palenque. The silence of her tomb for 1,300 years suggests that her people believed she had succeeded. They didn't return to her tomb. They didn't disturb her rest. They left her in the crimson dark to do her work. Today, when you stand in the plaza of Palenque and look up at Temple 13, the jungle air feels heavy with that same ancient intent. The Red Queen has been moved to a museum. Her cinnabar-stained bones under glass, her malachite mask staring out at tourists from all over the world. But the mystery of her life still haunts the stones of the city. She represents a time when the world was governed by the movements of the stars and the color of blood. She was a woman who wielded power in a civilization that saw the feminine as a vital, equal force in the balance of the universe. As we leave her story and move toward the modern world, we carry the image of that red dust with us, a reminder that we all seek a way to be remembered, to be preserved, and to find a version of immortality in the face of the encroaching jungle. The Red Queen found hers in cinnabar and silence. Frida Kahlo, the canvas of pain and revolution. The final leg of our journey through the shadows of history brings us to a bright, cobalt blue house in Cayocan, on the southern edges of Mexico City. This is the Casa Azul, the place where Frida Kahlo was born in 1907, and the place where she would eventually draw her final breath. To understand Frida, you must first understand the environment that shaped her, a world of vibrant Mexican sunlight, deep religious tradition, and the sharp, intellectual influence of her father, Guillermo Kahlo. Guillermo was a German-Hungarian photographer with a melancholic soul and an eye for precision. He taught Frida how to look at the world through a lens, how to notice the minute details of a shadow or the texture of a stone. Her mother, Matilda, was the opposite, a devout, often emotionally distant woman of Spanish and indigenous descent who provided the cultural anchor for Frida's fierce Mexican identity. Frida was born into a world on the brink of revolution. A time when the old ways were being torn down to make room for a new modern Mexico. But the revolution wasn't just happening in the streets. It was happening within Frida's own body. At the age of 6, she contracted polio. In the early 20th century, there was no vaccine and very little understanding of the disease. It left Frida bedridden for 9 months, isolated from the world, while her right leg withered and became thinner and shorter than her left. It was her first taste of the solitude that would define her art. To hide her deformity, she began wearing layers of thick socks, and eventually the long, sweeping indigenous skirts that would become her signature. But the limp remained. Other children called her Frida, wooden-legged, a cruelty that she met with a fierce defensive intelligence. Her father, recognizing a kindred spirit in his daughter, encouraged her to do the unthinkable for a girl of her time. He taught her to swim, to box, and to play soccer to strengthen her body. He also opened his library to her. While other girls were learning to sew, Frida was reading philosophy and studying anatomy, dreaming of becoming a doctor. She was a cachuja, a member of a rebellious group of young intellectuals who wore caps and debated the future of the world. She was brilliant, limping, and full of a fire that seemed too big for her small, fragile frame. She didn't know yet that the polio was merely a rehearsal for a much darker act. The gold dust and the iron rail. The afternoon of September 17, 1925, was ordinary until it was catastrophic. Frida, now 18, was traveling home from school with her boyfriend, Alejandro. They boarded a wooden bus, which was soon racing through the streets of Mexico City, trying to outrun a streetcar. In a moment of sickening metal and splintering wood, the two collided. The bus was crushed against a wall. The impact was so violent that an iron handrail snapped and pierced Frida's body like a spear, entering her left hip and exiting through her pelvis. Her spine was broken in 3 places, her collarbone snapped, her ribs were crushed, and her right leg, the one already weakened by polio, was shattered into 11 pieces. When the dust settled, those who rushed to the scene saw something surreal. Frida was covered in blood, but she was also shimmering. A fellow passenger had been carrying a packet of gold powder that had burst open during the crash, coating her broken naked body in a layer of glittering dust. It was as if she had been turned into a tragic, gilded statue. The recovery was a slow-motion descent into purgatory. For months, Frida was encased in a series of rigid plaster corsets that held her broken spine in place. She was flat on her back, unable to move, staring at the ceiling of the blue house. It was here, in the stillness of her convalescence, that the artist was born. Her mother rigged an easel that could be used in bed, and her father gave her his old oil paints. A mirror was placed on the canopy above her, so she could see her own reflection. "I paint myself because I am so often alone," she would later say. Her first self-portrait was a quiet, haunting work, but it was the beginning of a lifelong obsession with the externalized self. She used the canvas to perform an autopsy on her own soul. She didn't paint the world outside her window. She painted the landscape of her own pain. She painted the metal rail, the broken bones, and the cold, clinical reality of her new life. The accident had ended her dream of being a doctor, but it had given her a new vocation. She would become the doctor of her own trauma, using a brush instead of a scalpel to understand the fractured girl staring back at her from the mirror. The elephant and the dove. In 1928, Frida was strong enough to walk again, though she would never truly be free of pain. She sought out Diego Rivera, the titan of Mexican muralism, a man whose massive, politically charged frescoes were redefining the nation's identity. Diego was 20 years her senior, a gargantuan man with a reputation for both genius and infidelity. When Frida climbed the scaffolding to show him her work and asked if she had talent, Diego was stunned. He didn't see the polite sketches of a young girl. He saw a raw, unflinching honesty that he had never encountered before. They married a year later, a union her parents famously described as a marriage between an elephant and a dove. It was a relationship built on mutual creative admiration and absolute emotional destruction. Diego encouraged Frida to embrace her Mexican roots, and she began to wear the elaborate dresses, heavy jade jewelry, and woven hairstyles of the Tijuana women. She became his muse, his confidant, and his fiercest critic. But the marriage was a battlefield. Diego could not be faithful, and his affairs most devastatingly with Frida's own sister, Cristina, pushed Frida into a spiral of heartbreak. She responded by taking lovers of her own, both men and women, including the exiled Leon Trotsky and the photographer Nicolas Muret. Their lives were a whirlwind of revolutionary politics, travel to America, and constant drama. Yet, through it all, they were tethered by their art. Diego was the one who understood the depth of her genius, even when the rest of the world saw her as merely a colorful wife. He called her the only artist in history who tore open her chest and heart to reveal the biological truth of what she felt. Their love was a second accident, one that left her psychologically fractured, just as the bus had left her physically broken. She painted herself as the two Fridas, one loved by Diego and the other rejected, their hearts connected by a single bleeding vein. She was a woman who lived in the shadow of a giant, but she used that shadow to grow a garden of symbols that were entirely her own. The reality of the broken column. In the 1930s and 40s, Frida's work reached its peak of medical surrealism. She traveled to Detroit and New York with Diego, but she felt like a stranger in Gringolandia. While Diego celebrated the machines and the industry of the North, Frida painted her miscarriages and her longing for the soil of Mexico. In the painting Henry Ford Hospital, she is alone on a bed in a vast empty plain, connected by umbilical cords to symbols of her failed pregnancy and her damaged pelvis. It was an image of female experience, so raw and so graphic that it shocked the art world. She refused to sanitize her life for the male gaze. She painted her unibrow, her faint mustache, her surgical scars, and her blood. She rejected the label of surrealist when it was offered by Andre Breton. "They thought I was a surrealist," she said, "but I wasn't. I never painted dreams. I painted my own reality." Her reality was a constant battle with a broken column. As she aged, her spine began to fail her again. She had to wear heavy steel and leather corsets just to stand up. In her paintings, she depicted her body as a classic Ionic column that was cracking and crumbling, held together by a network of white straps. Her skin was pierced by hundreds of nails, symbolizing the chronic, stinging pain that never left her. Yet, in these portraits, her expression is always one of terrifying calm. She stares out at the viewer with a gaze that is both a challenge and an invitation. She used her Tijuana dress as armor, a vibrant embroidered mask that hid the rotting mechanics of her body. She became an expert in the art of the mask. Even when she was in the most agony, she would spend hours doing her hair and makeup, turning her own face into a masterpiece of defiance. She was painting a revolution of the self, proving that a body in pieces could still hold a soul that was absolute and unbreakable. She transformed her medical history into a sacred mythology, making the world look at the things it usually turned away from: the blood of childbirth, the hardware of surgery, and the loneliness of a long-term patient. Viva la vida and the eternal blue house. The end of Frida's life was a masterclass in the triumph of the spirit over the flesh. By 1953, her health had deteriorated to the point that her right leg had to be amputated due to gangrene. She was devastated, writing in her diary, "Feet, what do I need them for if I have wings to fly?" That same year, she had her first solo exhibition in Mexico. She was too ill to walk, but she refused to miss it. She was carried into the gallery on a stretcher and placed in the middle of the room in her own four-poster bed, which had been moved from the Blue House. She spent the evening drinking tequila, singing with friends, and celebrating her life amid her paintings. It was a wake held while the guest of honor was still breathing. Her final painting, completed just before her death in July 1954, was a still life of vibrant red watermelons. Across the pulp of one, she scrawled the words "Viva la vida, long live life." Frida died at 47, but her afterlife has been much longer and louder than her time on Earth. The Blue House is now a museum, a pilgrimage site for millions who find strength in her story. Her image has been commercialized, yes, but her Fridomania stems from a deep human need for authenticity. In a world of filters and curated perfection, Frida Kahlo remains the patron saint of the broken, the rebellious, and the unapologetic. She is an icon of feminism, disability rights, and Mexican heritage. She taught us that beauty isn't the absence of pain. It is the courage to transform that pain into something that can be shared. As we close this long journey through history, from the muck of 1325 to the diamonds of Russia and the red dust of the Maya, we end here with Frida. She reminds us that while we might not last a day in the Middle Ages, the human spirit has always been capable of enduring the impossible. So as you drift off to sleep, remember the gold dust on the blood, the cinnabar on the bones, and the watermelons in the sun. The past is dark, but the people who lived through it left behind a light that still burns. Good night. The Victorian underworld, the great stink of 1858. If you thought the open fields of the 14th century were a sensory nightmare, welcome to London in the mid-19th century. It is the height of the Industrial Revolution, the age of progress, steam, and steel. But for you, the common resident, it is the age of the pea super. You wake up in a cramped tenement in the East End, and the first thing you notice isn't the light, it's the lack of it. Even though it is mid-morning, the sun is a pale, sickly disk barely visible through a thick, undulating blanket of yellow-gray smog. This isn't the romantic London fog of poetry. It is a toxic cocktail of coal smoke from millions of domestic chimneys and sulfurous emissions from thousands of factory smokestacks. It has a physical weight. It tastes like soot and sulfur, a gritty metallic flavor that coats the back of your throat the moment you take a breath. It stings your eyes until they water, and it settles on your skin like a layer of fine black silt. In the 1850s, the air is so saturated with carbon that the sheep in the parks turn black within days of being sheared. If you wipe a white cloth across your windowsill, it comes away as dark as ink. This smog doesn't just sit in the streets. It creeps into your home, through the cracks in the door and the gaps in the window frames. It settles on your tea, your bread, and your bed sheets. To live in Victorian London is to live in a state of permanent smudginess. You are constantly coughing. The London cough, a deep, rattling sound that everyone in your tenement shares. You don't know it yet, but this air is a slow poison, filled with particulates that clog your lungs and lead to a premature death from bronchitis or consumption. But to you, this is just the smell of progress. The smoke means the factories are working, the steam engines are pumping, and the British Empire is the workshop of the world. You simply adjust your cap, wrap a grimy muffler around your face, and step out into a world where the visibility is less than 3 feet, feeling your way along the soot-stained brick walls as you head toward the river of death and the great stink. As you navigate the labyrinth of narrow alleys, the smell begins to change. The acrid scent of coal smoke is overtaken by something far more primordial and terrifying. You are approaching the Thames. In 1858, the River Thames is not a majestic waterway. It is a slow-moving, 200-mile-long open sewer. For centuries, Londoners have treated the river as a universal bin. Every day, hundreds of tons of raw sewage, animal remains from the Smithfield markets, and toxic runoff from the tanneries and gasworks are dumped directly into the water. Because the Thames is a tidal river, this waste doesn't just flow out to sea. It sloshes back and forth through the heart of the city, fermenting under the summer sun. The year 1858 brings an unusually hot summer. A heat wave that turns the river into a thick, bubbling soup of human excrement. This event would go down in history as the Great Stink. The smell is so powerful that it creates a literal crisis of government. In the newly built Houses of Parliament, which sit right on the riverbank, the windows have to be draped in curtains, soaked in chloride of lime to neutralize the stench. Members of Parliament are seen fleeing the building with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces, unable to debate the laws of the empire because the air itself is nauseating. The common belief is that this miasma, the smell of decay, is what causes cholera. You watch as people scurry across the bridges, their faces turned away from the black, oily water. Every time a paddle steamer goes by, it churns up the bottom, releasing a fresh plume of methane and rot that makes the world spin. You are thirsty, but you know that the water coming out of the public pump is drawn from this very river. To drink a glass of water in London is to participate in a game of Russian roulette with your intestines. You choose a pint of gin or a tankard of porter instead, preferring the fog of alcohol to the very real possibility of dying of the Blue Death within 24 hours. The hidden killers